substantially equal in population.
Two presentations as I'm working on redistricting. It's interesting to hear stuff happening at the ground roots level and sort of learning through all that type of stuff. I'm going to attempt to cover 12 years or more or less of stuff in 45 minutes. So we'll see how this sort of works out. I'm going to try to tell some stories and sort of work through how we can then use geospatial technologies in different ways to sort of look at elections. I'm a geographer, trained geographer, have been doing election studies most of my life, I guess professional life as a professor and those types of things. So we'll just kind of jump right into it. Oh, hello. Oh, okay. I thought someone popped in at the sound. Okay. Anyway, yeah, we'll start in 2008. I got here in 2009, not knowing that the next decade was going to be nonstop, I guess, electoral chaos in the state of Wisconsin. I will. Okay.
I don't know what's going on there, Ryan. Sorry about that. I'll keep an eye on it.
All right, no problem. Sound like a dog. Anyway, so if we kind of look back, go back to 2008, and I'm going to go through and how we can look at these at the county level, and how we can look at the voting district level, and how we can use different types of ways. And many of you that are land information officers in your local counties, other industries that you're all in, we're in kind of a heyday of geographic information and how this stuff is presented. So maybe you can get some ideas associated with the things that are going on out there. So we can start in 2008. If you're a Democrat, you're pretty happy, right? Barack Obama wins. Wisconsin hasn't gone away from Republicans at the presidential level since 1984. And you look at this election up in the corner, and it was pretty easy win by Barack Obama. And you can see the county level analysis on that. Now, in just a bit, we're going to be talking about some electoral theory and how things have sort of changed in 2010. So we go from 2008 to 2010. Obviously, the economic crisis hit, the housing bubble. Scott Walker, kind of unknown throughout the state. If you're from Milwaukee, you probably knew a little bit about him. Sort of won this landslide election, or I guess landmark election, you could say. This sort of on the backs of the Tea Party movement. This is where we see people like Ron Johnson and these other things across the United States sort of taking over Wisconsin and shocking everyone and leading to some interesting stuff that was going to happen in the next couple of years. And so we're kind of looking at these landscapes and sort of looking at what counties are doing what. As geographers, we're really interested in the spatial patterns of elections. Now, the unfortunate aspect about geography, a lot of time you have to wait for the election to happen to see what, why those things occurred. But we can kind of get a sense of, if you've known this Wisconsin elections, you can kind of look at this map and know generally where Democrats are, generally where Republicans are. Specifically, when you take your head all the way back to 2008, 2010, the map looks as it is. Well, we can then, kind of take this and I'm one of the crazy people that tries to deal with these voting district maps. I'm very thankful for the information that's provided by the state of Wisconsin to allow us to go back all the way, and you'll see this back to 1990. But here's a voting district map, and I kind of like these as a geographer. You have to really understand what's going on in Wisconsin. A lot of times people just see red and blue and just assume everyone that's a Republican is a Republican. Everyone in these red areas and blue areas act a certain way. But these local level maps, if you know your geography, you can really start drilling in to understand what's happening. One of the easier ways to see that, if you know where some of the Native American areas across of Wisconsin are, you can see those things sort of standing out in these seas of red at times. That's just one example that you have to kind of understand what's happening at these local levels to really understand what's happening at the election patterns at a map, something like this. Okay, so, we're getting to 2010, Republicans sort of took everything over. Wisconsin was the only state in 2010 that went all Democrat to all Republican. So the state legislature flipped from Democratic control to both the Assembly and Senate. And then obviously the governor took over, and then things got pretty interesting pretty quickly. Now, we're going to revisit V.O. Keyes in just a bit. He talks about this idea of critical elections. These are elections that sort of change the electoral landscape. In 2010, when these elections occur, you don't know if they're critical elections. You have to wait for the election actually to happen and then see what happens in the preceding elections after it. 2010 certainly was for the state of Wisconsin, specifically for state level elections. It changed things, okay? Now, Scott Walker, and at that time, Ryan Priebus, Paul Ryan, his power was sort of moving up. You really start seeing the things changing at the state level And it was sort of a laboratory that was happening across the entire United States from 2010 to 2016. We'll get to Donald Trump in just a bit, but these playbooks straight from the ALEC, the Koch brothers, you know, tax cuts, Act 10, union busting, cutting education, voter ID laws, school vouchers, environmental deregulation. These were things that were being really pushed in the state of Wisconsin that would eventually kind of leak themselves all the way out in the entire country. And Wisconsin, in my opinion, has played one of the most important roles in the last 10 years, not just in Wisconsin, obviously, but at the national level as well. Now, on the opposite end of this, what happened across the entire country in a lot of places, the Democratic Party basically was powerless and stunned. I think they just weren't anticipating this was going to occur. And they started, you know, using this playbook of, we're going to concentrate in Madison, we're going to concentrate in Milwaukee, that'll be enough to win us any election. We're not so interested in what's happening in other parts of the state. So they lack this kind of agenda that really looked at the geography of the area as a whole. And as we pointed out, was just pointed out, by 2011, 2012, the the redistricting that led to some of the gerrymandering certainly had profound influences moving forward. Now, what can we look at some of the social, cultural, political implications of this? And I'm kind of focusing on what gerrymandering can do. And I'm kind of moving forward from 2012 to today. But what it does, it starts creating deflated electorates. They're very boring elections. And you'll see in the slide just a bit, if you want to be excited, don't look at state assembly and state senate elections in the state of Wisconsin. They've been pretty boring over the last time. It's a maintained power. The primary becomes more important for the party in power than the general election itself. And those people that did sort of go against what was happening can be primaried out. And we're seeing that sort of being floated now nationally with Trump and all the other types of stuff. You know, we think about Scott Walker and his budget strategy of Wisconsin divide and conquer. This creates antagonistic groups. Family and friends are at odds. And you'll see a slide in just a bit, having worked in a university UW system. Obviously, I still have some family members, and we don't really talk about it anymore because of the cuts and everything associated with it. You can make drastic changes to laws because you're completely in power, right? Kind of this, oh shucks, you lose type of situation. You play to your base, which helps you at times if you can distract from the misery that's happening at different levels. If you think of economic misery, you start pushing other sort of social, cultural types of things, it can really distract what's happening. I'm thinking things like education funding and the implication that this has happened at local levels, the decline in dairy farming. All right, so these are types of things that you can kind of distract the electorate away from the realities per se at the ballot box. And what it does is it changes voting culture. And this then becomes reflected in the maps and way geographers start looking through things. And I don't want to read through all these, but these are all some of you that remember this back in 2010, 2011, using things, you know, gay rights, marriage, the Christmas tree, which still keeps going on, right? Concealed carry. The wolf hunting's back again, deer hunting, we see the Act 10 protests. These were all stuff that were happening basically at the same exact time, and it was sort of a chaotic time. But it led, because it's happening in geographic levels, we can look at this with mapping election results to sort of see these things play out. And these, I guess, I remember this was in Chippewa where a wife hit her husband because he went to vote, I think, for Walker, and she said he should vote for Barrett. We see this type of thing. People just don't like talking about politics. And this only exacerbated with Trump, right? It's just continued to go on. This started in Wisconsin and continued to happen associated with that. I'm not trying to make fun of violence at all, but it's just, you got to put in your perspective that she ran her husband over an election over politics. Is pretty interesting how heated people get over these things. All right. I don't want to spend, we talked about the primary, and the primary gerrymandering creates systems as this true check on these candidates. And for the Republican Party, you had these rural candidates specifically that were yes men, right? And most of them at that time were men. Best job they ever had, they'll do anything they said. And there were a few that actually kind of bucked against what they wanted, and they were primaried out. And so this is what happens at gerrymandering. The true check becomes then the primary. And again, we can see that reflected in some of the election things associated with that. And what this slide here is showing, right, that what's happened in Wisconsin over the last decade is races where incumbents are easily winning. You see less primary challengers and then unopposed elections, because what's the point of trying to run against someone, because you're most likely going to lose. So you can kind of see some of those things play off. All right. Now, changing topics a little bit, I think it's very interesting that because this is a conference that you all are talking about information, and land information becomes spatial, geospatial information, in terms of, I guess you could argue we're sort of in this heyday of election data. Everyone's very interested in looking at maps, mapping election data. It's everywhere, right? We see an increased interest in elections, good, bad, or indifferent. Social media kind of constantly keeps our heads wrapped around these things. We also see an increased interest in maps, but we also then becomes, the public is able to do more of this than they've ever had before in the past with QGIS, other mapping softwares. You see Steve Kornacki. I wish I was Steve Kornacki. He made things pretty cool that, he's now one in the top 100 sexiest men in America, right? Doing election stuff. It's pretty cool stuff. It's becoming a popular type of thing. We see this came out a couple of weeks ago from the New York Times. Just incredible. If you want to waste half an hour of your day, click on, go to this link and you can sort of analyze and people can start doing it. Now, the interactive side of this is that it brings people, right? Interactive data, interactive GIS. I think Joseph Kursky had wrote about this, talking about those types of things. It's more intimate. People become more interested, and that's a good thing, right? So those of you that are in control of your information at your different levels, you could see maybe you get requests all the time for data. Now, I kind of stumbled across this thing on the internet, on Twitter, called Election Twitter. It's very young people generally. I'm old at this point. They love making these maps. Now, I'm not saying the maps are all good, but needless to say, people are interested, and the more people that are doing geography, the more they're interested in geography, I'm all about it. But they're mapping everything. It's incredible, the stuff that people are trying to map. Looking at them, this next map is really fascinating. That these are the last time a Democratic won a county over 60% of the vote. They have time on their hands. The point I'm getting at is, I think there's a lot of interest, but we have to understand the geography, and this is where the disconnect happens. People aren't really understanding the geography and understanding the reasons potentially why those patterns are actually occurring. But needless to say, it's a great thing that people are practicing these things. It's a lot of QGIS, and I'm all about that type of stuff. Okay, some theory. Now, why I do geography and why that's different than political scientists. Okay, political scientists kind of snub their nose at geographers, but needless to say, they play an important role, obviously, in studying these things. Now, what most political scientists are going to be doing is they're going to be concentrating on this idea called the individual behavior tradition. They're interested in behavior. So they use surveys and they ask those questions about surveys and ask people why they're participating in the way they're doing types of stuff. It's more of a psychological aspect. And you can get really into the history of it. They kind of broke away in the 1920s of historians and sort of focused on these surveys. And the first real use of national surveys for Jeopardy happened in 1952, 1956, the Eisenhower and Stevenson elections, where you had places like Gallup asking questions about people and asking them what they do. Now, what they do is they take those groups of people and put them into a group, right? People 18 to 24, white voters, African-American voters, Hispanic voters, etc. Now, the questions are based on this idea, this trilogy idea. Now, these are in quotes. Typically, number one, party identification tend to be the most stable aspect when we ask questions. So surveys are only good if you keep asking them over and over again. So if you're a Republican, you tend to stay Republican. If you're Democrat, you tend to stay Democrat unless something dramatic occurs and changes the way that you see stuff. So if we really look at these types of ideas, the survey and the party identification questions tend to be the most stable. Okay. The second then becomes issue orientation. What issue becomes important? Is it tax cuts? Generally not the most exciting for most people, but tends to be up there. Things like abortion. A lot of times you can change people's minds in some things you can't. The last one becomes candidate image. That tended to be the least stable, but I'd say with social media now we're starting to see maybe this candidate image is becoming more important than the issue itself, or maybe even party identification. It's very interesting that surveys have to sort of deal with this. But political scientists will take this data, they'll aggregate it, then they'll sort of then say, in Wisconsin, X group voted this particular way. Okay, so that's kind of what they're doing. That's different than geographers, and someone came up with this term called the group ecological tradition, where we're really interested in aggregating data over spatial areas. Is that the county level? Is it the voting district level? Whatever it is, we're taking data, we're adding it together, we're looking at it, and then looking for the patterns associated with this. Now, political scientists tend to scream this ecological fallacy till the cows come home. That's, making assumptions that, well, that area is blue, therefore they're all Democrats. That's not exactly, but they do the same thing with surveys. Needless to say, I'll just move on from that. So geographers are really interested. Now, the unfortunate reality for the geographers is we have to wait for the elections to occur. The surveys are taking place before the election, and we can project potentially what's happening. Now, the best way is to sort of bring the two together. And that can be difficult to bring the two together because geographers do their thing, political scientists do their thing, and they tend not to play along. Anyone in academia knows how that stuff sort of works out. But as a geographer, this is what I'm really interested in, is trying to aggregate these things and look at the geography to try to understand what's happening at the ground level. Now, I talked earlier about this idea of V.O. Keyes. He actually was a political scientist, but we adopt him as a geographer. He was a Harvard professor, wrote this amazing stuff back in the 50s, The Theory of Critical Elections. If you ever want a really good book about early geography, it's called Southern Politics by V.O. Keyes. Is a great book where he really looked at the geography of elections. He came up with these three ways of looking at elections. We have maintaining elections, these deviated elections, and critical / realigning elections. When we think about the normal vote, and we're going to get into this in just a bit, we'll get into the geospatial stuff. This is sort of looking at, we say voters stay home. The election patterns that happen from one election look very similar to the next one. It's sort of maintaining the normal period of electoral processes that are going on, okay? Most elections tend to be maintaining elections. Something big has to happen to sort of change things. Now, a deviating election might be we call voter vacation. The best example I could think of 1964, the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Johnson took over, ran 1964. A lot of people just decided to vote, I think, because of feeling. I wasn't alive back then, but the feeling associated with that. By 1968, those that had jumped ship from the Republican Party went to the Democrats, went back to the Republican Party, and elected Nixon. That's a good example of a deviating election. Some of that happened in 2016 too, I think, with Hillary Clinton and Trump. Now, number three is where we, again, we have to wait for elections to occur after to make a determination if something is a critical or realigning election. This is this major shift in the normal vote. So what we were seeing in one geographic area, what was happening for 3-4 election cycles was very similar. All of a sudden, the next one, the patterns don't look the same. Well, we can't assume that after one election, that was a realigning election. You got to wait for the next election or the next election after that. For governor elections in Wisconsin, 2010, and at other elections, really kind of was realigning election in the state as a whole. I would argue of something like that occurring. And so we kind of look for these, and as V.O. Key talks about, we ask the question, what the heck happened to realign the election process? 1932, the Great Depression, right? 1928, 1932, those things are also great examples of realigning elections, the New Deal period that took place after that, as an example. So that's one way that we can kind of look at elections and look at the geography to try to figure that out. Now, I'm not going to get too math nerdy on some of these things, but stuff geographers have been doing a while. Clark Archer, Peter Taylor, kind of pioneered all this stuff, is using a factor analysis. And the best way to use and discuss a factor analysis is it's a fishing expedition. You sort of throw data into something and see what the heck comes out. And one way that we use factor analysis for looking at elections, we do it two different ways. We call time mode, a T mode, and an S mode. Now, the T mode looks for those voting periods. So you take the data, you throw it into at the county level. This is what we're looking at here is Wisconsin elections back to 1900 at the county level. And we're looking at similar patterns at different time periods. We call them electoral epochs. Now, this doesn't mean if we look at 2004, every single person voted for a Democrat. It might have been a county that voted for Republican and it continued to vote for Republican. This other county might have voted for Democrat and it voted for a Democrat. What we're really interested in is to see potentially where did these realigning or critical elections take place, and ask the question, what was happening in particular places for that to occur. Now, the most recent epic right now is 1992 was one of those elections across the United States that changed the election patterns from 1988. Now, what had happened, if you remember back in 92, it was kind of Bill Clinton sort of snuck in because you had Ross Perot and the first George Bush sort of took each other's votes away, and Bill Clinton sort of stuck in. But those patterns that we see, blue states versus red states, really established themselves from 1992, and that's continuing on to 2020. Yes, there's some flipping that goes on, and we're going to talk about that in just a bit. But we can kind of go back through and sort of look at these things. And you can see some elections just don't work well. The 1932 election didn't work so well for Wisconsin. We see the 1924 election did load together with these two, but that was back to the fall at times. And I'm not going to lie to you, I don't know what was going on in 1916. So one way we can do is by looking at, let me jump. I stopped sharing my screen. My bad. Is using story maps. And this is a research project done with one of my students this past summer. And what we did was we put together all the information for all presidential, Senate elections and governor elections at the county level up to 2020. And so we can do is we can look at those epics and then ask these questions when we can get to actual 1916. It takes a bit to load, I apologize. And if you really want to see what's going on, you can see what the election patterns we're looking at in 1916. We can click on the counties, see how Wilson was doing versus this Hughes person, and really start using. So this is an interactive way that we can jump all the way to the present, if you want to, and start looking at these voting epics. Here's 2016 in Wisconsin, and start examining things at the county level. And it becomes interactive. We learn where counties are. We can see what the vote is, and it allows us to sort of give the people looking at it a bit more ownership of the data, because they're the ones playing with it. It's not super interactive, but it does give you some information associated with that. So that's one way that we can use interactive web pages, and you're going to see I have a different one later that does it at the voting district level, but only back to 1990. So my student, I got to give my props to my student Cameron Wingren for really helping out and doing all this stuff. He graduated this past fall. So that's one example I think is interesting. We can use that T-mode analysis to identify the epics. And then what we do is we jump to something called an S-mode analysis, where then we can take what's happening in this voting period from 1992 to 2020 and see what's actually happening at the county level, see what the patterns are and what counties are performing one way versus another. And that's what this is showing right here. Now, this map may not look like what you're expecting. So this would be this voting period from 1992 to 2020. And you can see the factor analysis turned out 3 regions. The green regions are these we're going to see called declining Democratic regions. The blue areas are I call general Democratic increases. And then Washington County becomes like this traditional Republic. You got to come up with names, and I'm not very good at coming up with names. So that was the best I can come up with. So what you do is you look at the counties, say, that are green, and you take the 3 counties that had the highest factor loadings, and then you map the trajectories. And that's what this is sort of showing. In those areas that were declining Democrat, we see from 1992 that the 3 counties that were loaded the highest in the green were Burnett, Pepin, and Rusk. And you can see they kind of actually increasing a little bit in Democrat. And then 2008 happened, and you can see this slow decline in Democratic support. And then it really accelerated, and then sort of staying out in this particular way. The general Democratic increase, we can kind of see general increases in Democratic support. So what this is saying is that these green counties are following a similar trajectory as this. Now, they're different percentages. Some might be up in the 60% and declined to 55%. Some might be 20% and went down to 15. No, it's not that bad. Okay, 35% down to 30%. But needless to say, the green areas are places that are showing this general Democratic decline. The blue areas are, oh yeah, sorry.
This is Colleen, the moderator. I'm not seeing green. We're seeing your online map.
Oh, did I not? Thank you. I guess I have to stop sharing and share again. Yeah. Are people seeing that now?
Yes, thank
Okay.
you.
Sorry about that. Thank you. So this is what I was talking about, the green and the blue. Sorry, people are very confused. So the green areas are these declining Democratic areas, and the blue areas are the Democratic increasing areas. And so the trajectories that we're talking about in the green areas followed this pattern from 92, and we're kind of flat, maybe actually increasing subtly. And then by 2008, we see this decline. The blue areas were the general increase in Democratic support. It's not huge, but we see a patterning. So these are the top 3 counties loading in those S mode factor analysis. And again, some of these counties are very Republican, like Taylor County, and some aren't as Republican, say as Vernon County, but needless to say, they're showing this decline in Democratic support for presidential elections, versus the blue are showing this slight increase. And so that started asking these questions: if I'm studying this or I'm a candidate, what's happening in those areas to change those election patterns that are happening on the landscape? So that's one way that you can use the data at the county level along with statistics and geospatial technology to sort of promote these types of ideas, and then ask the questions, what's happening in those places for those election patterns to occur that they are. But it doesn't look like the normal map that you're used to. And when we get to 2016, a lot of people are excited about 2016 for various reasons, good, bad, or indifferent. You had a candidate with Donald Trump in Wisconsin. Was the first time they voted for a Republican since 1984, and Donald Trump barely won the state. Now everyone gets excited because you hear these things. They flipped. It's a red state now. All right. He only won by 20,000 votes, but we can really start asking the questions if we start drilling into what was happening. And this is a chapter I wrote in this particular book, was what Donald Trump was able to use geography to promote his messages to change the election outcome. And if you look at some of his campaign rallies between August 5th and November 6th, he went to 4 different places in Wisconsin and Minneapolis. And besides, you would say Waukesha being a very traditional Republican area, these other places Republican leaning, but it was really to kind of push some of that base out. And if we look at Eau Claire, those of you from Eau Claire, I see some of my former students here that might have been here when that occurred. It was pretty crazy times, because we have to look at then the media markets. And I actually went through and analyzed every one of his speeches, and whoever did his speeches was smart, because he spent more time on different topics at different places. For Eau Claire, he was really hammering on immigration because of the declining dairy industry that was taking place over here, and what people felt as the threats of Hispanic immigrants that have come in to take some of those jobs. That message wasn't as strong. He concentrated more on Make America Great Again, China taking those factory jobs out of the Fox River Valley. And what you see here is the media markets. I think people hadn't figured out, these are generalized media markets for TV. And for Eau Claire, why people come to Eau Claire all the time, it's one of the biggest media markets in the state. It extends up to about Spooner all the way down to Prairie du Chien, especially the NBC affiliate. What you also see here on these red ones are the conservative radio stations. There's only one liberal radio station, that's in Madison in the state of Wisconsin. So these are all ways that these messages can be promoted. And when you really start digging into understanding what was happening, you see the changes taking place on the landscape in these rural areas that Democrats have sort of ignored, Republicans have sort of hammered, and they're using some of these techniques to sort of get that out there. And Donald Trump just really kind of capitalized on that, probably more so than any recent candidate in a long time. And when you see between 2016 and 2020, Trump was coming back to the same places when he could. He went to Wausau a few times. He was in Green Bay. He tried to come to different places, and then COVID hit, and that sort of threw things off a little bit. But Scott Walker, when he was running, was in Eau Claire every 2 weeks. Every 2 weeks, and he got on TV every single 2 weeks. Tony Evers has been up here one time, but I know it's COVID time, so it's a little different. Needless to say, it's pretty interesting. One way I'm trying to transitioning now into using voting district data, and some of you know what voting districts better than I do, but one publication that we did was illustrating how you can manipulate data to adhere to what the clerks are giving in terms of data. until you do what the LTSB and give us all the wonderful data that you give us. Sometimes we can't wait for the 6 months for it to occur. And so the one way we can do is look at, here's an example. I'm from this place in Marathon County, right outside Marshfield. I grew up here, where there were 3 voting districts. The data is reported as all the township. So you got to dissolve the districts. And this article kind of talks about how we can do that. So we can look at these maps that I showed you earlier from 2010. And this is an example here of, this is obviously comes from what was provided by the interpolations for 2020 back to 1990. It's pretty interesting to look at the voting district level, but we can see in 2012, the popularity of Barack Obama by 2016. If we think about that county level map I was talking about, the Democratic decline, you can really see the rural areas popping for Donald Trump. And then you can kind of see some of these suburban areas as well. And you get more robust answers associated with that. And we can look then what was happening at the difference between 2016 and 2012. You could, so this would be looking at how did Donald Trump, or this is what, how did Hillary Clinton do compared to Barack Obama on the left side, right in here. And then this looks at total votes between Trump and Romney. And you can see where Trump did really well, where it's red, he gained votes, where it's blue, he lost votes. So this is that suburban area that really didn't adhere to some of the stuff Trump was saying. And it hurt him. And it was one of the few areas that Hillary Clinton actually saw increases in vote besides Madison. And in here, it's pretty interesting asking those questions of potentially why. Again, I talked about this with the other things going on, where we have to then understand the geography, that because what's happening for Republicans down in this area doesn't mean that's the same stuff happening up in these areas. And so we can kind of generalize by understanding different regions of the state, the northern area, where there's continuous job declines, struggling schools, but it's generally an area that's ignored by Democrats. Once Dave Obey left in 2010, that was the last time a Democrat even came close to winning anything up here. And when he left, a lot of those voters left because the Democrats really didn't focus on that. We see some of the stuff Donald Trump was pushing with declining frac sand mining, immigrants on farms. Obviously, I talked about this, the manufacturing jobs. China is a major threat, specifically the paper industry, et cetera, et cetera. So this is how we can kind of use this election data that's available, as long as you can manipulate it and get it into a GIS to make these particular maps. The geographer comes along to really try to understand what's happening at that particular scale. And then there's 2020, right? This is a county level map. Everyone's saying, well, Wisconsin's blue again, right? Well, Biden barely won the state. He won by 20,000 votes. So, if we go back to that T-mode analysis, the election patterns really didn't change that much from 2016 to 2020 to even back to 1992. They've been very consistent in the state of Wisconsin. At the county level, we don't see a whole lot of fluctuation happening. What we're starting to see is some wobbling taking place in suburban areas, as well as the Fox River Valley. But we're seeing even more, if you're a Republican, you're happy to see this area getting red, but you're not very happy to see this place slowly going from dark red to this pink color. And this area is getting closer to that purple to potentially blue in the next couple of years or so, potentially. So these are sort of looking at how these election results can kind of help us understand that. And this would then be a voting district map that I put together painstakingly, trying to aggregate data, what the clerks are pointing out, and realizing that every election's not always put out the same exact way. But you're able to end up with a map like this that looks like Donald Trump, just like if we looked at county level map of the entire United States, right? Looks like he easily won the state of Wisconsin. Well, if you know Wisconsin, you know that the population centers tend to have more people and more voters. But you can use this sort of rhetoric. He said the election was rigged. Look, the state of Wisconsin's red. More people must have voted. Well, doesn't take into consideration that's happening in these places. Now, one last thing that we can do with some other statistics is using freeware. Some of you might have used this software. It's called Geota. It's a free software. It allows you to bring in geospatial data, things like shape files and other types of fun stuff, to do a whole lot of spatial statistics. Yes, Esri allows you to do this, but in my opinion, it's kind of clunky. I like Geota, but the maps that are produced aren't really that nice But needless to say, one way we can look at this is talk about this idea of spatial autocorrelation. The first law of geography is everything's similar, but things that are closer together are more similar than things far apart. Spatial autocorrelation takes that into consideration, and we can then use that software to sort of see map clusterings. So if we look at this, if we use percent Biden at the voting district level in 2020, the dark blue areas aren't Democratic areas. These are low areas of low Democratic support surrounded by other low areas of Democratic support. So if you want to look where the base is, where's the super base of the Republican Party in 2020? It's these blue areas, right? Whereas the red areas then are areas of high Democratic support surrounded by other areas of high Democratic support. And you can see the cities easily pop out, but the big ones, obviously Milwaukee and Madison, and some other things. Now these off colors, you don't really see the light, low, high, but we look at Menominee County, which is an area of high Democratic support surrounded by lower Democratic support, and it sort of stands out as its own island. So if you understand statistics and understand how to bring that data in, it allows you to then even dig further to see where are the most ardent supporters. Yes, this map shows that too, but this is really kind of showing us a different way if you dig into the data a little bit more to understand these things that are happening. I could show maps all day of trying to figure out, the electoral chaos that is Wisconsin 2018, right? We went from Donald Trump to Tony Evers, surprisingly being Scott Walker. That leads to 2020. Everyone thought it was going to be an easy win for Biden. You can kind of see what's happening where Biden did better than Evers, and you can really see the Waukesha area and sort of the disdain for Donald Trump potentially, and Biden took advantage of that. But obviously, he didn't do as well in the rural areas. And as someone that studies elections, I was actually surprised how well Donald Trump did in those rural areas. I knew he'd do really well, but it actually stood out more than I thought he was going to. So pretty interesting stuff. Again, we can kind of go through all these maps till the cows come home. I'll just leave it at that. I've rambled on long enough. I think it's important. I appreciate all the work you all do, especially those of you that deal with this data, to get it out there so that nerdy professors like me can sort of dig through it and try to make heads or tails out of what's happening and the electorate home front here. So if anyone has any questions, I certainly can. There's my email, personal website if you want to get to some of those online atlases. I didn't show you, there is actual voting district one. I love people to play with them, and if you find anything wrong with them, certainly let me know. I'm not perfect. So I'll just leave it at that, and we'll take questions. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Ryan. Very fascinating. I'm not seeing any questions coming into the chat, but we can give it a minute in case somebody is just about to hit the enter. Otherwise, this will give us time to queue up our sponsor videos. And hopefully you can stick around. If questions come up, we'll keep monitoring the chat and address them after our final presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks again.